Welcome to Breakthrough Ideas. I'm Jeanne Ives, co-founder of Breakthrough Ideas. Last week, Governor Pritzker gave his State of the State and budget address. Well, it's time to talk about that in detail. And with me today is Ted Dabrowski, president of Wirepoints. I'm putting Ted in the spotlight to fully discuss that budget. Ted, welcome to our program.
Thanks, Jeanne. Thanks for having me.
Let's just get started here. Jim Day is an opinion editor with the News Gazette, and he wrote an article about what happened in Springfield last week. He said, finally, it's clear that Illinoisans have charted a consistent political course. Big spending, big taxing, big government, all the way. It's not going well. Well, I agree. It's not going well. But did you see anything different in Governor Pritzker's budget last week?
No, I usually agree with everything Jim says, and this is the first time I disagree. It's always been clear for many, many years. He's absolutely right. This is just the same old thing. It's just another budget that balances in the way that we've always balanced it, but it does nothing to address the problems we have in Illinois. It doesn't address a single one of the problems.
So I was always very curious, were they actually going to sell the Thompson Center for the fifth year in a row for the magical number of $300 million? I mean, that was one budget gimmick that was used over and over again. We don't know if that's in this budget or not, but we do know that the other gimmicks have stayed, right? So they are counting on some tax credits. They're counting on moving some funds into the general funds. What else are they doing? That's game.
So one thing is you have $1.3 billion of cuts, these unspecified cuts that we never really understand how they happen, if they happen, and it's never clear. So, Lori Lightfoot uses the same kind of, we're going to cut the budget. So that's one. Two, they're going to move funds from other priorities into what's called the general fund, the main budget. Sure, you're filling this hole, but you're creating a hole somewhere else.
That eventually has to be repaid back.
That's right.
Right?
That has to be paid back.
Yeah.
Then you've got $1 billion in these corporate tax hikes. They're calling them tax loopholes. Again, that has to be legislated. And Pritzker saying there's not a tax hike, but that is a tax hike. When you remove loopholes, it doesn't matter. Somebody's loophole is somebody else's tax hike or taxes. So there's a whole bunch of there. But what it doesn't do is fix the problems, as I said. And we've got probably 5 core problems that aren't touched.
Okay, so let's go through those 5 core problems that you think aren't being talked about enough.
Yeah. Well, I think first you got to start out with we're losing more people than any other state in the country. And when you're talking about a state like Texas since 2010, I forget if it's 2010 or 2000, they've grown by 4.1 million people. And in that same time period, we've shrunk. We're one of the 3 or 4 states that shrunk. And so you have to, anything you do in your budget should say, am I doing things to attract people and attract businesses and grow our state? Or is what I'm doing going to scare people away and make it harder to live here, make it more expensive? And that's the bottom line. I think you start with that one. And nothing in this plan said Illinois is going to be more affordable for people. It's not, are we going to have better paying jobs? No. Are we going to end our corruption? We don't do any of that.
Right. And you talked to me previous to us starting this program saying, why are we talking about the numbers, Jeanne, when we're not talking about the big problems that drive these numbers? Ostensibly, he did cut the budget from last year from $43.5 billion down to $41.6 billion.
Can I interrupt you right there?
Yes, tell me about that.
Right, so
is that true?
So people say he cut the budget. Well, the last budget relied on $6 billion of federal money. We didn't have the money. So he just said, well, to balance the budget, we're going to count on $6 billion from the federal government. So it's not that he cut the budget. We're coming to the realization that we are not getting the money from these canned kicks and other areas, bailouts, to budget.
Right.
So he had to cut it because of that.
Sure. So looking back across last year's budget, which is a great starting point for this year's budget, in April, Senate President Don Harmon comes out with this preposterous proposal to ask the federal government for $42 billion in additional assistance for the state of Illinois, just out of the blue. I mean, not related to COVID, nothing, just some $42 billion number that the federal taxpayers are going to come in and salvage the state of Illinois. He was laughed out of the room, and that's when Mitch McConnell used the B word, bankruptcy, in terms of the state of Illinois. Then you move into May, and they pass a budget that's 6% larger than the 2019 budget that they passed. in the midst of a COVID pandemic where
Yeah.
people are losing their jobs, where do they think they're going to get this money from? That budget had a known $5 billion deficit, and that was their starting point last year. They got none of that money. They're still counting on it.
We have no idea.
Right?
Yeah.
And so the last year's budget is still massively unbalanced at this point, correct?
Right.
And then on top of it, in the middle of the summer, they decided to borrow in 2 different tranches, $3.2 billion from that special federal fund for COVID relief. And that's got to be paid back.
It's got to be paid back, yeah.
Over the next 3 years. So that's, on average, over $1 billion a year that has to be taken out of Hyde to pay back money that was borrowed.
And yet the budget is balanced now. According to them, right? According to them.
According to them.
Yeah, so you're hitting on the whole problem is that, these budgets, and this is what I've been saying recently,
Mm-hmm.
these budgets mean nothing.
Right.
Because they're balanced every year. But if they were balanced every year for the last 20 years, how did we end up being almost a junk-rated state? How did we end up with these billions each year in additional debt where we have the most debt in the country? How did we end up with the highest taxes on top of that? So when you add all those things up, it doesn't make sense. And so the problem I have talking about one-year budgets is that they've got us, looking at the shiny object, talking about these different line items, when in fact we should be talking about the massive reforms that should probably be done as part of a 5 to 7 year budget. Talk about it that way and figure out what is the right way to get Illinois back on track, even if it takes us 7 years. And what are those reforms that have to be put into place over that time?
That is a great way to talk about it, and that is something that is never discussed there. They just simply think about an annual budget at a time. Now, we know that there are numerous legislatures actually in the nation that only meet every other year. Texas, one of the biggest states in the
Every 2
union,
years,
only meets every 2 years. They do a 2-year budget. And then you've got some wiggle room. You can think more long term. You're not always on the election cycle of making promises in a budget year that are never going to do the best things for the people that stay here.
Not only that, but if you only meet once every 2 years, in theory, you only have time to talk about the important things. You don't have time to do all these stupid little things that
Well, another
that you might do
budget,
if you're in session all the time.
and we suggested that too. In fact, I'm sure that there was at one point legislation filed saying that we are not going to take care of ancillary political issues and other bills until we have a budget. But that's not what they do in the state of Illinois. They wait until the very last moment, the very last hour of the very last day in regular session to pass the budget. And
With 1,000 pages, right?
It's over 1,000 pages. It gets dumped on your desk with 2 hours to vote on it. So, and it's all done in the back rooms between a few legislators on each side of the aisle.
Right. So it kind of comes back to if we're talking about the budget, then we're not talking about the real issues. And everybody knows it's so boring to talk about because we've been talking about the same thing over and over. This pension debt that grows every single time. People's eyes glaze over. And so, the realization that people have to come to, I think, is that this debt is now so big that it's putting like a second mortgage on everybody over the next 20, 30 years, right? Everybody, in addition to paying whatever costs they have for their families, for their homes, for their health care, they've got to pay out this massive pension debt, which at the state level, according to Moody's, is about $250 billion, right? That's a big number. Well, just, when you start divvying that up over families and add up all the pension debts, we're probably like close to 100,000 per household of pension debts that each one of us will be on the hook for over time.
So I have to
It's
save
massive.
for all of my retirement, and then I'm on the hook for at least $100,000 for somebody else's retirement, no
And then
matter
you're
how
gonna get
long I've
taxed
lived
on.
here.
Yeah,
That
and
you're
you're
going to
gonna
get
get-
taxed
yeah,
on eventually.
Yeah, that's a great point. Even if you move in here next year, if you come out from out of state to Illinois, you suddenly owe that money.
That's right.
And that's
but if I move out of Illinois,
it's
I
gone.
don't,
and
I
see,
don't owe that money.
and that's what politicians keep missing out on. The same thing for the people who oppose reform is that people don't have to stay in Illinois. As long as there's not a wall built around Illinois that keeps everybody here, people can escape that $100,000 debt just by moving over the border into Indiana or Wisconsin, or go further to Houston or Georgia or whatever.
And they will. And they've
Well,
done
they-
it for the last
not just they
7
will,
years.
they're doing it,
They're
right,
doing it.
right.
Right. But let's talk about, I know you may not want to talk about line items, but I think the
Sure.
pension line item is very alarming in Pritzker's budget. First of all, it is about, if you add in the pension line item plus retiree health care, it's well over $11 billion, and it represents 27% of the budget as it sits right now. That's an enormous number compared to other states. Do you know how that falls in comparison?
Oh, we're by far the number one in the country, by far. And that's based on the
Oh yeah, that's right.
The
That's
county,
the funny math.
yeah, see, that's the
Yes.
funny math. That's the
Yeah.
official math. And when you start to do the real math, if what the actuaries say we should be paying, then we're still by far number one, but the numbers become much higher.
That's right.
Close to half of our budget would be going to pay for pensions and retirement costs, like retiree health insurance, that state workers get for free.
So let's make
So
sure that
it's
the
massive.
listener understands there's a statutory amount that is set in legislation that must be paid into the pension system every year. But then the pension systems themselves calculate an actuarial amount, which is the real cost of these pensions if you were to pay them out in a normal
If you're trying to fix the
way. If you're
problem,
trying
pay
to
them.
fix the problem, if you're going to try and pay them out in a normal time frame in the lifetime of that employee. And those two they're off a good $2 to $3 billion every single year.
Yeah, it's a huge difference. Well, no, I mean, if you look at it, it's probably more to 3 to 4 billion for pensions, and then we have something called retiree health insurance that state workers get once they retire, and
that's after 20 years of service.
After 20 years of
They
service, it's
become
free.
eligible for free retiree health care on the backs of taxpayers.
correct. And so that one we're always underpaying by $2 to $3 more billion short. So we're never paying what we should be paying, and that's the joke on taxpayers is that the politicians act like they've done something good, they balance the budget, but those debts are accruing.
But I thought
and
we
then come the
reformed-
tax hikes behind it.
I thought we reformed pensions.
No, we've never.
I thought we reformed them in 2011. I know the 2013 bill failed. I was there when that happened. Oh, but we did a big, massive a pension reform bill, Tier 3, in 2017. And what's the result of Tier 3?
Well, it never happened.
It never happened. It never happened. They passed the legislation and did nothing with it.
That's right. So this is a typical example, and and they get a lot of credit for doing those things, and people forget, the media forgets, and the problem.
I didn't forget.
The problem continues to fester. No, you never.
I didn't forget.
Jeanne, you never
One
forget.
other thing that I didn't forget about, and which I found was interesting in Pritzker's budget, is he literally put a line in, because it's easy, if you're looking at a budget document, it's easy to not put in particular, to basically separate out individual expenses if you want to hide it from the taxpayer. Well, they didn't hide it at all. They literally have a line under expenditures called Chicago Teachers Pension System. And last year, we put in $267 million. This year, we're putting in $277 million projected. And it's a separate line item for Chicago Teachers Pension Systems. Now, I think what most people don't know is that 4 years ago, when they did the education funding formula change in 2017, it was signed, it was legislated in September, it finally passed then. What happened is state taxpayers became responsible for picking up Chicago teacher pensions' normal cost. That was just 4 years ago. 4 years ago, that number that we had to pick up, $221 million. In 4 years, it's grown $56 million to $277
It's like
million.
25% increase in 5 years.
That's a
4
20.
years.
And the weird thing about it is Chicago teachers themselves only put in how much, Ted?
Yeah, 2% of their payroll. Of their normal teacher puts in 9.
A normal teacher puts in 9. So we are picking up the preponderance of the cost for Chicago teachers now, and they are putting in a fraction of the money that other teachers are putting in. I mean, this is so unfair on its face.
It's unfair, and I've been thinking a lot about how this plays out, because for people, like we said, pensions are complex and they're hard to understand. But I was recently in Peoria, and all these cities have the same pension problem.
That's
these
right.
pension debts, the police and fire, the teacher pensions, they draw so much money from households that it's really making everybody struggle. Now, people may not always know exactly why, but I was driving around Peoria, and I went through a whole bunch of different neighborhoods, just looking at the houses and just seeing what does it look like. And what I came to the realization is, and I'd learned this before from people in real estate, is that when your property taxes get so high, when you don't trust the system anymore, when people are starting to leave, you stop investing in your home. Why would you put in $20,000 or $30,000 or $50,000 in a home that you know is going to fall in value and the taxes are going to keep going up? And you can see it in the homes. They're still intact, but you can see that people aren't putting in the money. And that's how you start that cycle, that vicious cycle where communities start to decline. And that's this part that scares me.
for anybody listening, Ted and I have been literally working together for almost 10 years on policy of all sorts. And one thing that we did do, because we've always been about pensions and pension solutions, and you have a pension solution. I actually took your solution, put it into bill format, ran that 4 years. You've modified it subsequently. And one of the fun things we did, we went to Harvey.
Yeah, that was.
Do you remember we went to Harvey? We did a press conference. And it was all about pensions because they couldn't make their pension payment at all.
Yeah, and it's not about pensions; it's about people's lives in the
That's
end, right?
right?
Because it destroys cities. And I want to tell this part. The media asked you, Jeanne, why are you in Harvey? This is not your district.
That's right.
And you said because nobody else is here defending the people. And I thought that was awesome because nobody was there defending Harvey and the mess it's in. And they still aren't
right.
there.
And actually, that's what you can look forward to if we don't solve this big budget number, this big budget crisis, which is really pushed up by pensions. If we don't solve this long term, it's going to get worse. I remember also Ted and the head, the founder of Wirepoints, Mark Glennon, came down to testify on my bankruptcy bill, allowing municipalities to declare bankruptcy. And why was that? It's because Danville, the mayor of Danville, wrote me a 2-page letter saying we need bankruptcy protection. And so what have they done to solve their pension problems? They've added a line item to utility bills to help cover the costs, the additional pension costs, because they can't add it to the property taxes anymore.
Right. Well, and they can't do anything else.
There's nothing else to do.
The state government won't change pensions, won't allow them to reduce it. There's no way to. So what they've done is they just raise taxes. And I love that same governor told me that at one point they didn't have money to cut the grass in the city. So then when they had visitors come in, they would make sure that they drove the visitors in the nice areas and not the areas where they couldn't cut the grass. But this is what is the real life cost of these problems. That's
right. So so how do we get out of this? How do we move forward, do you think?
Well, it doesn't seem like there's no political will today under the current legislature to do anything. And Governor Pritzker, who should be leading this effort, has said that pension reform is a fantasy. And for us who talk about pension reform, we're dreaming. And he thinks that it would never pass. Even if we had a constitutional amendment, he says it wouldn't pass the federal contracts. Well, muster it at the federal level in the Constitution there. We think he's absolutely wrong, and we've proven it based on law. So unfortunately, it's going to take a crisis before we finally get to the reforms we need. I think it's not going to happen until it gets so painful, which is sad.
Well, and speaking of that, I mean, I would have thought that we were at crisis point now. Unfortunately, it looks like a federal bailout may be coming. So, I mean, what does that do? Kick the can down a little bit times? I mean, if we're looking at a $1.9 trillion COVID relief package, which includes $350 billion for local governments and state governments, and our share may be $13 billion. The state's share of that, $7 billion. So, I mean, what does that do to our budget projection? Save us for what, 18 months? What do you think?
Yeah, max. So to your point about you thought we were in crisis, well, we certainly are in a much bigger crisis than we were 5 years ago and 10 years ago. And we know that because the governor and the government are running out of can-kick options. And everybody's watching Illinois now. The rating agencies are watching like crazy.
Have you talked to them lately? What do they say?
Oh, not
because
recently.
They're basically saying, well, he gave us a balanced budget. That's what I've heard. We may move him up to just even look.
Right. Yeah. Well, they quote have balanced budget. They may be getting federal money. And if money, the rating agencies don't care where the money comes from. If there's money to pay off bondholders and the bondholders are happy, they're happy. We're not interested in protecting bondholders. We're interested in protecting the people of Illinois. And so just because a bondholder is happy doesn't mean that the state should be happy. So it looks like, with money coming from the federal government, if it comes through, it buys Governor Pritzker and others a year and a half where they don't have to do anything. They can just kick the can down the road. We'll wait till the next year and figure out how to move monies around.
So they can continue to make promises that we can't keep. He moves right into a 2022 election year.
Correct.
Where he hasn't really cut anything. But I mean, there could be a little bit of fallout. He kept the education funding flat. He's not funding this massive reform bill, formula reform bill that they did in 2017. That's got to hurt a little bit.
Well, politically it might hurt, but we spend more on education than any other state in the Midwest by far. We spend 50% more than Indiana on a per student basis. In Illinois, we spend 50% more than Indiana, close to 30% more than Wisconsin.
Yep.
And yet, he and others, and Governor Governor Rauner, wrongly as well, kept trying to put more money in education instead of, again, reforming pensions.
Right,
That's where all the money goes in education.
So after, when you're looking at line items in the budget, after pensions of well over $11 billion, you then have education at nearly $11 billion in the budget this year, $10.88 billion. And then you have human services at $7.4 billion, healthcare at $7.4 billion. So those are the big line items in the budget. We spend a lot of money on education. But only, the big criticism is that the state doesn't give enough to school districts, which is why the property taxes are so high. They all talk around each other, I think, in this. There's a huge cycle saying, we have to have high property taxes because the state doesn't give us enough money. We're spending a lot of money at the state level, too. It's just that we have so much additional education costs for the value that we're getting out of it when only 37% of the kids read or do math at grade level.
That's right. It's all bankrupted morally and fiscally.
Yes.
But I go crazy when we say the state doesn't spend enough on education. I live in Wilmette, the New Trier School District. We have 7 school districts within our high school district. All those superintendents and the sub superintendents and they all make multi-million-dollar pensions. And the state money, which Rockford contributes into, Effingham, Carbondale, all that money goes to pay multi-million-dollar pensioners that are superintendents and other bigwigs in these administrations. It's wrong. It's flat out wrong. Those things should be cut. We should go to 401ks. We should merge these school districts. And then we'd have a lot more money in the classroom. But what we're doing is we're funding bureaucrats and administrators, and then the money doesn't make it to the classroom in small districts in southern Illinois. Well, it doesn't make sense.
It's just interesting that our conversation has come back to this topic because just for fun on Sunday, I put out a little factoid on my Facebook page, and I said, look, Florida, population 21.5 million, the number of school districts, 74. Illinois, population 12.5 million, the number of school districts, 852. And then I went down into Cook County and DuPage County. Mm-hmm. And people like that, just comments were flying back and forth. And there were a few people that are our school board members are like, oh, but we can't consolidate school districts. You're going to have a problem with this tax rate and that tax rate and union contracts matching up. And I mean, it was one excuse after another not to actually do what needs to be done. And I actually think it'd be very easy to consolidate this. And I'm not even saying that you would go to one school district per county. Arguably, Cook County is way too big for that.
Way too big.
But I mean, and you don't want massive structures that you don't ever get to the lowest level. So, but there's certainly a way to get rid of 852 school districts. 25% of them are single school districts. 1/3 of them have less than 600 students.
There's teeny school districts.
Right.
There's single. We have a principal, then a superintendent, and a bunch of bureaucrats to go with that. It's waste.
Right.
I love local government. It's always something we have to make clear.
That's right.
We don't want to consolidate governments just to get rid of local governments because local is where it's at. What we hate is overlapping governments and duplicative governments, and we have lots of those. And that's what needs to go because it's not productive. Our state is weaker because we're not producing what we should because we have duplication and waste.
So will the voters wake up?
I say that I find a lot of hope. Some people push back on it. I find a lot of hope in that we block the progressive tax. And I say we the people, block the progressive tax. That was probably the easiest tax hike that should have been passed, right? It was the referendum pit 97% of Illinoisans against the richest 3%. They could have easily passed that thing. And people didn't vote for it. Yeah,
okay.
Right? People didn't vote for it. So blame whatever you want, but people didn't vote for it. So did we wake up a little bit? I think so. And I think people are trying to figure out this whole COVID stuff and being shut down all the time, and nobody really understands how it's all working. And these schools being shut.
Oh,
I think people's minds are being. I think it's an interesting period, and maybe we have a chance in Illinois for people to wake up before the crisis hits.
Well, I hope so. So we're going to wrap up our budget discussion here, and we're going to have you back again because, again, Governor Pritzker just simply put out a proposed budget, and we know this is not the final product that's going to pass in the last hour of the last day in May. So we'll be back to talk more about this. It's certainly an important topic. We'll see if that bailout from the federal government comes in, but the truth is Illinois is bankrupt, and we need massive reform in order to get out of that. Well, thanks for having me, Ted.
Thanks
Thanks for being on my show,
Thank
Ted.
you.
Appreciate it.